Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. So it's a couple of minutes past. I expect we'll get a couple of late arrivals, but I'll start anyway. So welcome, I'm Steve. And before we start, I just wanted to make like a trigger warning, okay? So this is about looking at the future, looking a long way ahead, looking at what might be occurring, and some of it isn't as nice as we would hope, you know. So some of this is pretty grim material when you start thinking about it and understanding it. So it's all right to feel bad about it, and feeling bad about it is normal. And talk to your friends, keep a journal, you know, find other outlets, or talk to me if you've got nobody else. But feeling bad about the climate crisis is a standard thing. So I'm going to talk today about Fairhaven, our novel of climate optimism, and the process of writing climate fiction. So what is it like to write climate fiction? What do you discover as you're going through that? And it is we've found as we've been working on climate fiction that it's a super powerful tool which takes you beyond the immediate set of problems and helps you understand the larger picture and what you ought to be doing. And then from that position, you can back calculate to what you can do today. So we found fiction to be more powerful than even I'd hoped. So can a story help us see about future? I think it can. So we're going to do this in two parts. And this talk is based on a couple of talks we've done elsewhere and workshops that we've done elsewhere. And it's got a lot of material in it. So in ideal circumstances, we'd have all morning, and we could do the second part as a proper, round tables and discussions and so on. But because we don't have time for that, I'm still really keen to get your answers. So I would like to know what you think the big solutions are. So as that's popping into your head, there's some post-its on the table. Please write it down, or send me a WhatsApp or an email, or whichever your natural form of communication is. So I really want to know your visions of the future, what solutions you'd really like to see, so that we can talk about incorporating those into future stories. So I have a broad background, as you'll soon hear, but I'm very conscious that I don't know everything, I don't know everybody, I don't know the opportunities that other people are seeing. So if you can share your cunning plan for solving the climate crisis, that would be really good. So in the first half, we're going to look at a little piece about background, so a bit about you and a bit about me, then about the process of writing climate fiction and what it can teach us. So introductions and backgrounds. So I sent you all a questionnaire. So there was 2 questions in the questionnaire, and I got about 50 answers for each one, so thank you very much. That was really interesting. And the first one is about how do you feel about the climate crisis. So this is something that we all don't talk about very much, but we all endure privately. So the words that came up from over 60 replies are primarily downbeat phrases. So they're despair, concern, anxious, and so this is how people are feeling about the climate crisis. This is their lived reality of it, and particularly with students, top end of school, into university, and people starting their careers in this field. This is the reality that they're living with, you know, and the climate anxiety that goes with that is a real part of it. So thank you all late joiners. So as I said at the beginning, there's a bit of a trigger warning with this session, so we're going to explore the outer edges of some of the more alarming pieces. And if you're worried about it, have a chat with me after. So this is the feeling of the people in the room. Okay, so how do we live with that, deal with that, and go forward with that? So I'm Steve. I'm a chemical engineer. It's LinkedIn on the corner, but the screen has got in the way, but never mind. My business card's on all of the desks, so please do get in touch. I've lived and worked in Malaysia for 18 years, and I originally came to do environmental work for the oil and gas industry. So I'm, and they've done a lot of things. They can do a lot of things. They're a key part of why we're in the mess that we're in, but they are, interestingly, also a key part of how we get out. So one of the things that it becomes very apparent working with the big industries and also using climate fiction as a tool is that we've got into this problem at an industrial scale. We've spent hundreds of years with maximum endeavor building huge things which have caused the problem. And if we're going to get out, we need to do it at massive industrial scale in the opposite direction. So that's what's required. And then you end up looking for which companies actually have that capability. Who can run a $20 billion project? And that is not a NGO, and it's not a charity, and even some governments will struggle to do some of that. It's the large contractors, the oil companies, the mining companies, the construction companies. They can run you a $10 or $20 billion project. And it's that kind of scale that we need to be working at going forward. So the scale is one of the big things here, big themes here. So I have a very unusually wide background. So I've dabbled in oil and gas and chemicals, but also agriculture and forestry and everything where we've had a look at climate solutions. So we've reached as wide as we can looking for the big solutions. And with my engineering friend, we set up a consultancy called Herculean Climate Solutions about 8 years ago to find the multi-million-ton climate solutions which will actually fix the climate crisis. So not just a little bit of efficiency here and there, but efficiency is important, but where are the big breakthrough things that we've just not noticed? So we ended up generating a list of these. Some have gone into startups, some have gone into companies, and some of them are living in real life. But our list is very long, and it seemed a shame to leave them sat in the drawer and going nowhere. So we took some of our big climate solutions and broke them into climate fiction to ultimately share with a much larger group of people. So the other piece of the background, I mean, you're all here, you all know this, is the climate crisis real? Of course it is. 5 minutes of searching compilation pictures will produce a whole load of harrowing pictures and stories. So yes, it is real. And some of these charts you'll be familiar with. And, there's one point of clarification I need to make. Yeah, so I've written Fairhaven, so a novel of climate optimism, with a co-author. So I'm an engineer, I write like an engineer, and therefore I need a co-author. And working with a co-author has been an absolute revelation because Jean-Vieve, my co-author, has a very different chunk of industrial experience. And working together, we produce work which neither of us could do on our own. So it's been really valuable, that. So when I'm saying we going forward, it's either we with my engineering colleagues or me with my co-author. So it's a mixture of we's. I'm not royal we. So is there a climate crisis? Yeah, so this chart is familiar to you all. And we're at this rather alarming little crossroads here. And as Jean-Vieve, my co-author, said, it looks very alarming because, end of the century hit 5 degrees and things aren't going very well. But as she correctly pointed out, we're here, not there. We still have an opportunity to do a whole load of things in this time space. It's not already a given that we're doomed. We've got a load of things to do, but it's not game over yet. So that's the important part of the optimism message. And so a novel of climate optimism, for me, the word optimism isn't about fluffy bunnies and happy endings and gentle music and romance. Optimism is determination, persistence, and grit. It's the thing that you have when you've been knocked down and you get up and you carry on and you carry on doing it. And if you keep going, you'll get there in the end. If you give up, you definitely won't get there. And there's, I included this slide because it's one that isn't often talked about. So the previous one is what's coming, and doesn't look very nice, but that's familiar to us all in working in this climate area. But the question of why isn't often explored. So how have we got into this mess? And this lovely set of graphs, which are all just little curves, about the Great Acceleration, explores how society expanded rapidly after the Second World War. So the cut-off point in all of these is 1950. And from 1950, a whole load of really great things started to happen. So real GDP went up, urban population went up, energy usage went up, water usage went up, so a whole load of really good developmental things started to occur. And at the same time, and often by the same people, a whole load of bad things have started to occur. So tropical forest loss and coastal nitrogen and ocean acidification, all of these things happened at the same time as a direct consequence of making things better. Things were made worse. And if we're going forward and looking through the lens of fiction, this is our history, if you like, and we need to build a story that's consistent with the history. So what is climate fiction? Climate fiction is in the simplest form, it's kind of like science fiction, but very focused on the immediate climate. So what happens next? What happens in 1, 2, 5, 10, and 50 years? But it's also ordinary fiction. It's literary fiction, or romance, or mysteries, or murders, or anything. And now that I'm meeting some of these writers, one of them said a really interesting thing a while ago, is saying that if you're writing and you're not including the climate crisis, what you're writing is fantasy. You're no longer writing a story which bears any resemblance to reality. So everything that you write, all your soap operas, all your conventional Netflix shows and so on, if they're not including the climate crisis, you're writing fantasy. And it may as well be about fairies and gnomes and so on, because it no longer bears any resemblance to reality. So why climate fiction, and why fiction at all? So I really like this simple idea from George Lucas of Star Wars. You can't do it unless you imagine it. So they were making films, obviously, as part of that, but we are now at this interesting juncture where we've got to 1.6 odd degrees and things are getting rather prickly. Where are we going? What are we trying to do? Where do we want to be in 20 years? Where do the younger folk in the room here, what's it going to be like when they're my age, and when they're even older than that? And we need to have a clear vision of what we're trying to do. A vision, a strategy, a roadmap. All of these things that used to be part of urban planning and so on. We seem to have kind of lost all of that through the determination to measure the data. And don't get me wrong, data is absolutely necessary, and we need to do some monitoring, but we also need to have a really clear idea of what it is we're trying to achieve. We're not just trying to comply, we're trying to go somewhere, and going somewhere is not the same as complying. So I get a bit provocative too. I apologize for that in advance. It's a feature as well as a bug. Yeah. So why optimism? Henry Ford was another controversial guy. You can't use all of his quotes, and a lot of his opinions were a bit, odd. But I really like this one. Whether you think you can or you think you can't, you're right. And if you decided you can't do it, you have 100% definitely failed. If you decided that I'm really going to try, you stand a much better chance. And what we found doing, some of the innovation projects we've done with companies and our own startups and so on, the further you get in, the more doors open, But if you've If you've given up and you're lying on the sofa eating donuts, you're definitely not going anywhere. You know, you need to remain engaged. So we wanted to write the fiction in order to encourage the engagement, to maintain the engagement. But the current fiction, the stuff about the climate, is almost universally bleak. So the American War, I'm not sure if this one's a piece of short-term prediction or what. The Drowned World is an old book from 50 years ago. The Water Knife is about massive droughts, and Termination Shock is about what happens if you have to do solar radiation modification. You know, so once you've got to those points, which pieces are on? So Neil Stevenson writes a nice, exciting thriller with plenty of romance as well, and he's got wild pigs and all sorts running around in that. So it's quite an entertaining story, but it's on the path to a fully failed system. You know, if you have to go to that point, you have failed. So on one hand, we've got climate fiction, which is, you know, grim, but fiction really does impact real life. So the first story here, Uncle Tom's Cabin, was the story that made a huge contribution to ending slavery. So it was widely read by loads of people at the time, changed public opinion, and slavery gradually became totally unacceptable because what are people were reading in fiction. The middle one here with with Star Trek, we all now have a Star Trek communicator, you know, and it is a direct inspiration for the people who are working on these things. What have I seen in science fiction? Can I make it, and can I shove it into a handheld device to sell? And the end one here, Day After Tomorrow, although it's about climate, and much of what they said is fundamentally flawed, it certainly raised awareness of the scale of the problems. And I'm short of time. There's plenty to say about the others. So we wrote Fairhaven and made it a novel of climate optimism because we wanted solution-focused, positive outcome stories that people could relate to and engage with and think, there's a character in there, that PR person, I want to be that person. I want to live in that life. I want to be part of building that new world. And so it's full of ordinary people doing ordinary jobs which happen to be pointing in a non-fossil fuel direction. It's pointing in the other direction. I'll explain the cover later on. But the need for that optimistic narrative is something that we felt was really important. So although there's plenty of grim things happen, they're all based on plausible reality, and it's not fluffy bunnies, it is a pile of things that are really big and could really be done. So when we're writing fiction, and at the same time when we're looking for large-scale climate solutions, so my background is I'm an engineer, I think like an engineer, I'm always looking for big solutions, and the finding a solution which would make a great startup and finding a solution which would make the core of a good story is the same process for me. You know? So when I speak to the other authors, they say, "Oh, you've got to identify your character and think about the clothes they wear and what their background is and which language they're speaking." No, none of that. What's the job they're doing? Because I can't take a Burmese refugee with one leg and put them on a nuclear power plant doing this thing because they're not going to be there. I need to find a person who's actually going to be in that story and write about them. So I need to identify my solution first and then populate it afterwards. So the commoner or the more widespread approach of choosing your character and then is just the same situation that we're all in. And most characters are powerless. So writing another story about someone who's powerless doesn't actually help. I need to write about someone who finds themselves in a position where they can actually do things and write about them. And then encourage people to become that person. So when we're looking at stories and solutions, There's you won't like these, so brace yourself. Okay. We use 4 awkward realities, 4 awkward questions, and then some mega trends. Okay? So the 4 awkward realities are, if you want to fix the climate crisis in effect, or make it better or make it less bad, we need to do 4 things, and we won't like any of them. That's the reality. And the 4 things are: slash consumption of all kinds. We really, really don't want to do that. We need to do renewables properly, and we're about 10, 15% into that job. Doing renewables properly also includes getting rid of the fossil fuels and the coal and the cement and the steel and all of that, or the emissions associated with it. We need to draw down a huge amount of CO2. So there's like 2,000 gigatons of CO2 in the atmosphere that needs to be put somewhere else. That's a huge task. And the startups that we were working on were focused on that, because there's nothing that's actually looking at that today, which is rather alarming. And then the last one is refreeze the Arctic. And normally when I run through this list, people are nodding, and then they laugh when you say refreeze the Arctic. So you've done very well restraining yourselves. But to my mind, refreezing the Arctic is the easy one. The hard one is slash consumption of all kinds. We really don't want to do that, Sorry. Oh, yeah. 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 No, absolutely. You're dead right. COVID was a lovely dry run. Yeah. Yeah. So refreezing the Arctic is one of the big solutions that we explore in Fairhaven. So we go into some depth about how it could start, who gets involved, what it's like, what equipment's used, how it gets deployed, how it gets paid for. All of that we explore in some depth in the story. But when we're looking for climate solutions or story themes, this is what needs to be addressed. Ultimately, if you're going to get to a long-term decent future, it needs to have dealt with or tried to deal with these problems. So the next was always 3 awkward questions, and I realized there was one missing. So when we're looking at startups, we're always looking for where you're going to put the CO2. And our question was always, will it work? And when we've seen other startups and worked alongside other startups and the accelerators, you get on the calls and you see the guys on the other side and you think, you poor guys. That just can't work. It physically cannot work. I can see you've put a year's worth of effort into it and you've done a lovely presentation, but it won't work. It cannot technically work. And this is one of the problems with VCs and accelerators and the whole startup process, is that it doesn't get to the end of, will this proposal actually physically work? Because the accelerators, who are generally not technical people, are saying, you need to build a team, you need a lovely pitch deck, you need to build a narrative, you need to blah, blah, blah. Won't work. So you've wasted years of people's time and money chasing things that just can't work. So it's absolutely essential that the stories that we put in the books work, or could work, but the startups that we started startups would also actually work, because there's a whole load of stuff which is, sadly, a waste of time. But there's also a whole load of stuff which would actually work, and we need to be taking the people off the projects that can't work and put them on the project that can work. So will it work? Will it do 1 million tons? So is it big enough scale? So our subtitle was finding 1,000 ways to do 1 million tons. So can you do a gigaton? You don't do it all in one big go. You do it in lots of different bits. And there's, when we started looking at this closely, we've literally a spreadsheet with 150 things that would probably work, most of which are not being tried. So that was one of the reasons we wanted to write the fiction. It's like, we're never going to be able to do these as startups ourselves. We can't find a guy to do it. Stick it into a book and give it free rein. Let's see if somebody else can do it. The third one is it a negative emission? So although we definitely need to do efficiencies, you can't diet yourself to zero. if you're improving your efficiency, so if you've got 40% efficiency improvement, that's great, but you're never going to get 99.9% efficiency improvement. You always bottom out. So we're always going to be using energy. We're always going to be doing things. So we need to find the things that are negative emissions. So in agricultural terms, that's a lot of biochar and those sort of things. But there are a number of different ways. So we looked at biochar in considerable depth, and also CO2 mineralization. So there's some great routes. And then the fourth one, which I don't use with other groups, is it still worth doing if there's runaway climate change? So particularly with things like reforestation and the bands of climate moving, if you're planting a whole load of trees in the area that's going to become desert, whether you like it or not, you've wasted your time, And so it's important to be honest enough to say we should do a different thing somewhere else. Do something, but do a different thing. And then the mega trends is really quite interesting. So this is what we were doing more from the day job, from the consultancy side, working with companies who had realized that they got a problem. So this particular example is a European pump company. They've had 100 years supplying high-tech pumps to the oil industry. They've got a really sound business. They've got a load of great expertise, but they can see that is coming to an end. They're no longer doing that stuff. But they've got some really nice toys in the box, and they realize that they're going to be gone in 15 years if they don't do something. So they'd found one other solution, and they realized that they needed a couple of dozen more to stand a chance. So they came to us to look at what the future is going to hold and to do some cross innovation with them to explore what they could potentially do. So we looked at the mega trends, which is on the next slide. So I'll open that for you in a moment. But we also had a close look at their portfolio of skills and their catalogue and what they can actually do today. And it turned out that they had a lovely high-pressure pump of an unusual type that I had not come across before, which was absolutely ideal for an unusual climate solution that I'd heard about and had thought about, but I'd never got to the end of how you would actually do it. But with their pump and this marine cloud brightening approach that is being pursued by other groups, there's the potential to do something very impactful very quickly with a company which already owns a pump. So ideally, and they haven't done it yet, ideally they would put a couple of $1 million to one side, set up a trial, show whether it would work or not. And if it were to work and they were able to then get the marine cloud brightening credits or albedo credits or whatever, they've then suddenly opened up a whole new business. And one of the inspiring things about this is that we're always looking, and it's really interesting to sit by somebody who's interested to look, but they don't know what's outside. And so when we found that working with groups and companies and teams are looking for other solutions, broadening it a bit and widening the team and bringing some experienced innovators along is much more effective. So if you take a standard team and ask them to brainstorm, they get almost nothing out of it. But if you use other innovating techniques, TRIZ and similar things, you can get a huge amount more. And if you bring an experienced player along, you get a load more again. So that it's really quite interesting. So how would you find the thing that you do? If you're trying to comply, part of the question is, okay, I'm going to try and comply, but how do I become a company of the future? How do I become a solution? Rather than just whatever it is I'm doing today. So these were the mega trends that we distilled from a bunch of other people's lists, and there's 12 items, and the ones that are often mentioned are automation and digital stuff, Obviously, we have a political situation going on at the moment. So there's a whole bank of things which will be really important going forward. And these are important for your startups on one hand, but also for your climate solutions on the other. Your climate fiction on the other. So the future as described in fiction also needs to deal with some of these points. So what we were saying to the pump company in this particular example is that, you know, you want to sell pumps for the next 100 years, and one of the realities is that the guys who go to maintain the pumps, the ones who go out to the ships and take the tops off, change the bearings and all that sort of stuff, these guys are going to be old by the time, they're in the middle of their careers. You're going to get a diminishing number of people who are available and have the skills to go and maintain your pumps on these ships. So you need to design your pumps so that someone with short sight and less flexibility can actually still maintain that pump. So you need to change the design so an old person can do the maintenance, you know, because that's who your group is going to be. So it's not a climate-related issue at all, but it does guide what they can do usefully in work and differentiate themselves from competitors. You know, so it's, you know, a pump that an old guy can maintain doesn't sound like a good thing until all your maintenance crew is old, and then those are the ones that you want. So there's a bunch of things happening, but over and above all of this, the climate crisis dominates. You know, so we need solutions that address the climate crisis. If we're aspiring to a great big digital network and then, you know, upgrading so everybody uploads themselves, as you read in some of the futurist projections, we can only do that if we have a functioning electricity network. And if we lose control of the climate and don't have, you know, the basic utilities, all of this highfalutin stuff disappears, along with all of our human rights and humanity and our ability to read and write and all of these other things. We need to maintain or try and remain in control of the climate crisis if we're going to maintain society as a whole. So this is, you know, nasty, gritty, painful stuff. But, you know, people like, you know, want to talk about health, and of course we want to talk about health. But you can only do that if you're managing the climate crisis as well. If you lost control of that, you can't manage your health. So with the pump company, we sort of like ended up at this point where in 20 odd years' time, all companies will either be a climate solution or they will have ceased to exist. You know, assuming that we're on a path to, we're not on the path to Mad Max. Okay, if we're on the path to Mad Max, it's all bets off, and those companies will still be doing whatever up to the point where they don't exist. But if we're actually trying to fix things, companies will be a climate solution or they will no longer exist. And then the question becomes, how do you take your company from wherever it is today to the point where it is a climate solution? You know, what skills, capabilities, unusual features do you have which will actually make that work for you? And it's surprising how much you can find from really unpromising ground. So to give you a slightly different example, we a few years ago we looked at the drilling industry. So the drilling industry doesn't sound like a climate solution in simple terms. But if you ask the question, how do you use drilling to fix the whole climate crisis, and just narrow it to that, and don't say you've got to do forestry and you've got to do all these other things, but say what is the most we can do with this one technology, and only focus on that without fobbing off the responsibility to somebody else. You find loads of stuff because you ask the question in a different way. You know, I have to solve the problem. I have to use this tool. What am I going to do? And when you ask the question that way around, well, you can do this, and then there's that place, and then there's, do you know about that one? And all of this other stuff comes out because you've removed the opportunity to say, give it to that bloke over there to do, you know? And it's a really interesting, unexpectedly powerful. So when we did this with one of our earlier startup routes, we ended up with a list of like 30 things to explore because we'd narrowed it. We'd made the question harder and therefore easy to answer. It's quite interesting. So, can a climate fiction story be optimistic? So all the stuff that we hear in the, in the news and so on is all pretty grim. Can a climate fiction story be optimistic? So the other question that some of you answered for me was, please list 3 films or TV shows that show the future as you imagine it. So I thought this was really quite amusing. So thank you very much. I thoroughly enjoyed this. And so we've got a few Terminators, some Mad Maxes, Resident Evil. Which one of you was that? Blade Runner. But as you can imagine, Train to Busan. I mean, really, I don't want to live there. but it's quite funny, really. But the dominant one's The Day After Tomorrow, so the climate crisis story that you're familiar with, and Mad Max and Wall-E. So Wall-E, on the spaceship is great, isn't it? But the Earth they left behind, they completely trashed. And so that is a vision of the future that's quite challenged. And there's nothing on there which shows a place where you want to go and live. You don't want to live in any of these places. You don't even want to live on Dune. Who wants to go to Snowpiercer Land or Walking Dead? I mean, that's got to be fun, isn't it? So thank you for this, because getting the data from groups is quite insightful. So what does Hollywood think? So I'm an engineer, so I like working with data. So I gathered 50 films about utopia or dystopia, okay? And I plotted them with my arbitrary scale on utopia and dystopia and plausibility and implausibility, okay? So these are my personal judgments, okay? And as you can see, in the top left-hand corner, we've got a whole pile of plausible dystopias. So this is all on the Hoover app thing, so you can all see the picture in detail. So it's in the photo section. But we've got Mad Max and The Road and Wall-E's up here and Soylent Green and Handmaid's Tale and all these rather, they're great movies, don't get me wrong, but they're lousy lifestyle choices. You don't want to go and live there. And then in our implausible dystopias, we've got Walking Dead and Waterworld and Snowpiercer and so on. And those are physically impossible because there's never going to be zombies. There's going to be angry Texans playing the role of zombies, but they won't actually be zombies. But anyway, that's a separate thing. In this corner, we've got our utopias, so decent futures that are implausible, and the only real one to talk about here is Star Trek. So Star Trek is in this corner because you can't go there straight away. The Star Trek world goes through its own Third World War to get to that point. So we don't want to go through that. And then in this corner of plausible, decent futures, plausible utopias, there's almost nothing, okay? So this one here, Ministry for the Future, is a book, not a film. And it's written by Kim Stanley Robinson, who's a classic science fiction writer, and I would absolutely urge you to read his book. So, but it's dark, and it's the story that a lot of the people in COP27 and COP28 had read, because it was quite new at that time. And so Kim Stanley Robinson, he opens his book, and he has a heat dome over India. And the first thing that happens in the book is that he kills 20 million people. So that's his tipping point to get large-scale societal action. And then he moves through a whole load of other things. And he does have some climate solutions, but unfortunately, several of his climate solutions are terrorism. And I kind of wanted to avoid doing terrorism if possible. So it's a thing. He describes it in great depth. The things he's talking about are have been done in various forms through history, but it seems a dark path to choose. So, oops, sorry. So we have Fairhaven in this corner, and we have it as not very utopian because it's going to be hard work, but it's going to be interesting, and once we get in there, it's going to feel better. And at the moment, it's not very plausible at all because we're heading off down the other path. But we wanted to put this on, fill this space. So this here is a great opportunity to imagine great futures. So, this is the undiscovered country, if you like, for writers. But the reason that writers write in this corner, oops, sorry, pressing the wrong buttons. The reasons writers write in this corner is because writers are usually English graduates, and they write about people, and they want to write about trauma and challenges and conflict and all that sort of stuff. So that's where you find it, or find it easily. There's plenty of trauma and challenge and conflict in this side as well, but they don't have the technical know-how to describe a workable solution which allows you to build an interesting and engaging story. So the couple who've tried to do that, they've written solutions which just can't work. And it completely undermines the whole story. You've got this noddy Robin Hood magic wand solution which just can't work. It doesn't actually help you. It's another piece of fantasy. So we wrote Fairhaven to try and address some of those things. And as I mentioned at the beginning, I'm an engineer and I worked a lot with the oil and gas industry. And one of the key pieces you notice when you go to the oil platforms is that the oil platforms have fabulously abundant marine habitat. So there's more fish around the oil platforms than there is anywhere else for two reasons. And the two reasons are there's actually an exclusion zone around the platforms so that the fishing boats can't get to them. So they get chased off by the supply boats. And the other reason is that the platforms are multi-story coral reefs in this area. So you've got this fabulously abundant habitat. So within the story, we explore a scenario where a Malaysian lady who's a marine biologist from an oil and gas background, oil and gas family. She's the black sheep of the family, and she wants to do these restoration projects. So she gets one of the old platforms and does a large-scale ocean restoration project around it. So she uses that foundational piece to make the biggest, best marine habitat that she can using existing facilities. And the information that we've gathered from previous projects is that this stands every chance of working, and that if you can go from ravaged seabed, which is what we have on this side, so completely trashed seabed, the bulk of the fertile seabed around the world, so in the North Sea, here in South China Sea and so on, it's been trawled to utter destruction. So before the advent of trawlers, it was full of soft corals and all little habitats and all sorts of things. But when the trawlers come along, it's like collecting apples from the forest with a bulldozer. So you get some, but you don't next time, or you get a few, and then fifth time round you get nothing at all. So the fish yield in the North Sea, back in the UK, is 2% of what it was 150 years ago, because it's been converted into parking lot. It's been trawled to total destruction. So if you stop trawling and put habitat back and allow that abundance to recur and give it vertical height to amplify its potential, and stop trawling it, so catch around the outside rather than around in the middle, you suddenly are in a position where in these waters it's like planting squares of tropical forest. So the seabed is as productive or has as much primary productivity as a forest. And planting more forest is tricky because usually there's either condos there or a plantation or something, and planting new forest is not an easy thing to do. But seabed has already been cleared, and you're just taking it back to what it was or better if you can, and managing it in a different way. So that's what we have explored in some depth in the story as a large-scale solution that could be applied at scale. So Fairhaven follows the career of a young Malaysian engineer, and she gets a job on a massive climate adaptation project in Penang. So as you know, Penang already suffers from flooding, and this is exploring, okay, that sucks, what are we going to do instead? And we chose Penang partly because it was a geographical position, but partly because the solution that we proposed is very controversial. So we chose a controversial solution where you protect it or lose it. There's no choice in between. You protect it or lose it. And if you protect it, it has other impacts that you really, really don't like. So the story is there to illustrate the fact that there's these difficult decisions to make. And as the sea level rises, you quickly get into the position where actually there's huge areas that we're not going to be able to protect, and they will become mangroves. And then there's a few places where we must protect them. So your core infrastructure, your power plants, your historical areas, your big cities, and so on. And how do you actually go about that? So that's quite tricky, and difficult to visualize, and very controversial because everybody's NIMBYing, and don't want to do that for very good reasons. But the reality is, difficult choices will have to be made. So she works on this huge climate adaptation project. She suffers from climate anxiety, and we felt it was important to include that because it's our lived reality, particularly for the younger people. And if you don't have climate anxiety, you haven't understood the severity of what's going on. It's a feature of knowing how bad things are. And so it was important to talk about that. And for me personally, writing the book about ways forward to actually do the things at the scale has been a way of dealing with it. So I wrote that into Grace Chan. She uses that strategy. She starts off with a journal, and the journal becomes short stories, and the short stories become a collection of short stories. And she gets involved in an unexpected incident, which gives her suddenly a high profile. And because she has stories to hand and they say, what else have you got? She's able to take her stories and make like a Black Mirror, Green Mirror series with equivalent of Netflix. So you're suddenly putting stories about how to solve problems. Like how do you save all of the people on the Titanic? Okay. Off the top of your head. I ask you all that, and only Sam will know because he's read the book. So how do you save all the people on the Titanic? Or how do you reduce the number of people who die in earthquakes? How do you go about doing that? So the stories are her fictional little stories, and we wrote those because last year we were starting to speak to some of the TV companies, and we realized we didn't have enough of them, so we wrote the rest of the set. So in some ways, Grace Chan is partly my experience, and particularly the writing of the stories piece. So we put that into her part of the story to carry through. But in Grace Chan's timeline, she becomes an influencer, becomes a high-profile person. That eventually allows her to become a politician, and that political path, which again Sam will know, is an unusual path which allows other things to be done. So, as we mentioned already, for me, Fairhaven is very much about scale. We need to think about really big things. What are the biggest things that we can do in each of our scenarios? Not just compliance, not just a little bit of greenwashing. It's how can what we're doing today become the biggest solution it can be. And the forests particularly are really interesting. There's lots can be done, but it's hard, isn't it? It's really hard. So for the climate adaptation, as we mentioned before, sea level rise is coming, and in doing the research for this, I spoke to a bunch of the glaciologists, the people who are out in the field. And although the IPCC reports are saying 1 and a bit meters by the end of the century. They say, no, 4 or 5. So their personal in the field experience of what's likely to happen is much worse than the averaged out IPCC report. And again, this would be a controversial view, but in terms of what is it we're going to actually try and do, I think anticipating 5 by the end of the century would be a sensible line, even though that's not the official IPCC line. So the other ones are repairing the ocean and buying time by refreezing the Arctic. So we touched on refreezing the Arctic at the beginning. And repairing the ocean is the big scale Rigs to Reefs project. So we have here 3 large projects which deal with climate adaptation, sea level rise for our particular part of the coastline and the city. And then we have 2 very large, potentially gigaton solutions which are capturing or avoiding CO2. So, or heat anyway. So the albedo and CO2 have a sort of equivalence. And then in the sequels, we're looking at and recognizing that there's going to be a lot of sea level rise. What do they do in Florida? So half of Florida is about this high above sea level. What are they going to do when it's 2 meters of sea level rise and they're starting to lose a whole lot of stuff? So we've written a load of fiction there about what the communities choose to do, what the insurance companies make them do, because their choices become limited. What do you do with the historic sites, because you've got things there are 400 or 500 years old, so there's some really interesting challenges about what they do there. And then we've looked at a range of other mitigation and restoration things about managing the inventory of the forests. So how do you avoid the Canadian runaway wildfires? Because if that's really releasing 2 gigatons a year, every year, and getting worse all the time, that really makes it a lot harder. We look at mineralization of CO2, which is a project that we worked on as a startup, and we also look at foods and agriculture and soils and so on. So the next sequel is pretty much written, but we want to write 4 or 5. And our ultimate goal is to get Fairhaven onto Netflix as a TV show. So the reality of nobody reads white papers or reports. So sorry if I've offended anybody. Nobody reads white papers or reports, and nobody reads books either. So people who buy books, but they won't read them. so they'll show support by buying a book, but buying and reading are entirely separate activities, as I'm sure many of you know. But if you want to reach the bulk of the population and change opinion and engage action, you need to do it through big social media or through Netflix or its equivalents. So we wrote Fairhaven with that in mind. So we wrote a story that could be adapted for TV. We set it in Penang because it'd be a great place to do a Netflix show because the food's good. And you can have all these little foodie little pieces on the side going, you know what I mean. But it's got lovely existing settings. And when we were looking at, where do you write your story, we wanted it to be as real as possible. But when you're choosing a location, it's, do you do Gotham City and Batman and have to imagine Batman and the city? Or do you do Sherlock Holmes and London Town? Because if you use London Town, you can look it all up, and the names are there, the pubs are there, incidents are there, and you can slot into a real fabric, which makes the story much more real. If you've got to build Gotham, come on, that's it. That's a huge, ambitious project, which makes it less real. So we wanted it to be as real and imaginable and doable as possible. So that's how far we've got. And I've no idea what time it is, so I just blether. And the next piece, I'd just there's paper and stuff on the desks. If you take a couple of minutes just to think about the solutions that you would like to see. So if you caught me in a coffee shop and said, "Oh, you're that author bloke, please put my solution in your book," I'd love to hear it, because you all have different perspectives, and the more perspectives we can include, the better. So that'd be great. And I'll have a drink of water while you do that. And any questions? So I've been monologuing. What time is it, by the way? 3 minutes. Excellent. I did well then. Okay, any questions? I'm sure someone has. We've been speaking to some people in the States who have good connections, and they're the ones who wanted the additional short stories. So, because we had 4 at the time, and they's like, no, they're good, but where's the rest? So okay. Sorry, say again. Oh well, we've got a long way to go. I mean, the 3-body problem, which is now on Netflix, there's like a couple of years arc to get there, and but he's a well-established writer with a pile of books. So if you're going to join that arc, you have to have a pile of books. So that was the task to do. Approaching them cold with just a concept, it's a massive problem. But they want to write things about the climate. They want to do things, but they don't know what to do. And Apple, bless them, did a lovely series called Extrapolations, which you may or may not have seen. It was 8 episodes. The first 2 were pretty good and fairly close. The rest, they just completely skied off. And they wrote some fantasy stuff about things which were irrelevant, not true, and misleading. And to my mind, looking to encourage people to get involved, that really doesn't help. You want to write engaging, reasonably factual, good quality stuff, which makes it's decent telly. And now I understand that when my town council says to me, we're going to have to make all these real changes, now I understand the scale, because people say, "Oh, but I love my waterside." Yeah, sure, it loves you too, and it's coming, and you're going to have to move, and that's like broader understanding of the broader issue is one of the many things that's absent.
Not so much over the questions. I'm just saying that how, like what you just shared, can make reading a sustainable reporting, which is going to happen in the next few months or next year, more interesting. Because on average, I just came from IFRS S1 and S2, and company have this integrated sustainable reporting. On average, is about 500 to 600 pages.
Boring, isn't it?
Yeah. So and then they talk about connected information. They talk about the standard qualitative characteristic, relevance, completeness, understandability. I'm not sure about how you read 600. So I just thought that I can actually see something about, especially talk about what does it mean for company. Isn't it they can do something similar when we talk about what does climate risk affects me in my 1 year, 3 years, 5 years strategic planning. Have you considered to sort of like talk to this business guy, especially the one that prepare reporting, to translate the boring stuff? By the way, I'm accountant, okay? But I live in different camps. So I actually in this camp, not downstairs or upstairs. Yeah. So no, definitely, I just thought that, when you talk about scenario planning, like for example, how do you see your next 5, 10, 25, 50 years? That is actually one of the criteria for climate-related risk, climate scenario testing.
Yeah, and
I've spoken
to a couple of companies, but as you all know, getting through some of these iron curtains is difficult. And a lot of these people. I'd love to help you all. My card's there. Drop me a line, and we can come and take some of this material, rehash it to do workshops with different teams. So we did a workshop with a certain large oil company a while ago, based around fiction, and we got them to imagine themselves in 2062. Same person, same age in 2062. What's your life like in 2062 if it's gone well, and what's that world like? And they all acted it out. So it was fantastic. It was a really entertaining morning. So very creative from their point of view, but difficult to do here because we haven't got enough time, and you don't know one another. So the barriers are too big, if you know what I mean. I'd love to do something with you all, but getting the yield is also important. So if doing it amongst work groups and getting them to imagine themselves and what their company becomes is really high yield, and I'd love to do that with you all. The scenario planning, again, I'm going to be controversial, so brace yourselves. To me, there's far too much measurement and not enough doing. Okay, so someone said to me this morning, of every dollar that's spent in the climate area, 65 cents goes into measurement and reporting, and to my mind, it should be 6.5 cents. It's not that it doesn't need to be done; it absolutely needs to be done, but we need to be doing a lot more doing, and the delivery of the difficult startups is really hard. Startups is a destructive process which destroys your innovators, and we need to find a way of doing that in a way that doesn't do so much damage. So, but working on the strategies with companies and using companies' existing asset base to build forward. Like take that pump company, get 4 guys and $1 million to go and do the trial, and it'll be done by Christmas. That's great, and you've got an answer. And it either works or it doesn't. And if it works, they can sell 10,000 of these things a year, and jobs are booked. But they would never have found that. They couldn't have found that. Next question.
On testing, yeah. So it's a great honor to actually meet the author of this particular book. I've always believed strongly in stories, and when I went to this one bookshop, and maybe you guys know it, they used to have they had a pop-up store here, the Sundar Shelves. The thing I asked is that, do you have anything on climate fiction other than all these non-fiction books? Somehow we have too many non-fiction books, which, like Steve mentioned as well, we put on the shelf, we never read, or we read the first 1/3. After that, we got it. That's it. But when I found that there is one of this at Fairhaven, you're going to try this out, you see, then yeah, I'm really happy for this. And as a result, I also looked up that also, if you guys would look interested, there's something called the Climate Writers League, and which you can tap into.
Yeah, I'm a member of that. Yeah, Climate Fiction Writers League.
These kind of things.
This is actually quite funny.
Just thank you.
Yeah, so thank you. Yeah. So the Climate Fiction Writers League, again, it's a mixture of people writing a whole load of different stuff, and there's romances and all sorts of things in there. And one of the things that is a recognised issue is writing about solutions that work. Because the tendency is, let's pile into another dystopian story, another a parable of the sower. Yeah, I just don't need that. I've been really depressed by the last one I looked at, and let's find something that actually describes something that works. So they are making a conscious effort to do that, but it is quite tricky because you need to build it on a story that goes. Because if you've got some, I read a lovely one about the Arctic, and he was dealing with the albedo in the Arctic by releasing all of these ping pong balls full of helium, and come on, no, and because all of the weight's wrong, and and it's just like it's physically impossible to do, and it completely undermines the premise of the story. So whatever else is said in there is like lost because it can't work. So, but there's loads of things that can work. Is it not? Ah.
It may be a spoiler for those who never read the book yet. Where do you guys get the idea for the AI taking over? That was really, I thought that was really, really interesting ending.
Yeah, it is a bit of a spoiler. So let's embrace that. So I've got a box of books over there if anybody wants one. As saying, Sunder Shelves also sell it. Kinokuniya have got it, and the other bookshops, and you can get it on Kindle. So I would love to hear your opinions, particularly from an informed group. So I want your opinions, I want your input, I want your thoughts for what needs to go into the future books. So that would be super. The AI piece, because obviously you can't write a book without having climate in it. Otherwise, it's fantasy, and you can't write a book without AI in it, without it being fantasy. So it has to have some part of that. But one of the first things that happens in the story, as you'll remember, is that for an unclear reason, all of the internet is off. So it's like one day the internet goes off. And because of that, these days, the power's off, the water's off, everything's off. So a whole thing goes down. And we wanted to start that because it's an alarming, sorry, eyebrows go up. It's an alarming premise to begin a story, on one hand, but it also illustrates the fragility of systems. So we take it utterly for granted. A whole of our lives are built upon it, and take it away and go, yeah, wasn't anticipating that. And but again, for a reason at the beginning of the book that's not very well explained, it comes back on, and things kind of return to normal. So and then there's all this effort to try and deal with the climate crisis taking place. But the role of that piece is really important going forward, because the AI and what computing can do gives us a lot, but it also challenges a lot of points. It can do some things, but it's a huge tranche of things it just can't do. And so I'll stop there without giving you. Yeah. So there's two books of short stories actually. So the very first one we wrote for COP27, and it's called No More Fairytales. So we did it with Southampton University and their Green Stories group. So again, this is quite a funny story. So I'd done a couple of stories with the Green Stories group, and I spoke to Denise, who organises it all, and I said, wouldn't it be great if we had an anthology of positive outcome climate fiction short stories for COP27? And so this was the year of that Egypt COP. And I spoke to her in March, and it was in November. And she said, it's in November. That's impossible. Let's do it. So we pulled all of these things off the hook, because he had all these writers available. And in the course of 7 months, we wrote a nice, big, fat, good quality anthology of positive outcome climate fiction stories, which exactly fitted the brief. And it's good. I like it. And we got stories from Kim Stanley Robinson and Paolo Paglialupi and other well-known writers. So we pulled in a bunch of proper names. But when I made that suggestion to her, I didn't know that it took 3 years to write a book. Now I know that it's supposed to take that long. But to be honest, that's an unacceptably short period of time, particularly in the climate area where we've got a lot to do in a short track. So we wrote that for COP27. Fairhaven was written for COP28, so we took 5 stories out of No More Fairytales and made Fairhaven out of it. The most recent book we did for COP29 is Grace Chan's short stories, so we needed to write that because of the TV people we were starting to speak to. and we have the next sequel in the bag, and we've got 3 more to do. So there's there's a proper plan, and we were lucky in some ways. So when we wrote Fairhaven, we completely ignored America. So it's everything we've written is still true. So, but we wanted to write a story which was much more Asian focused, and picked on possibilities that could be done in this region rather than relying on the West and the North to solve everybody's problems, which they've not done yet. So when are they going to start, you know? So there's huge potential and opportunity here, and great entrepreneurial spirit. And if you can find a way to make these things positive and useful and profitable, people are going to be all over that, you know. So we wanted to make sure that we included that. So I suppose to conclude, I'll wander back over here. In some ways, the main players in the stories are companies. So in my experience, the money flows through companies, stuff is done by companies. Obviously NGOs and other groups certainly help, but things are done by companies. So we need to persuade companies to do the things that need to be done. And so the stories are partly a way of illustrating that. So these are the 3 stories that we've written so far. So No More Fairytales was COP27, Fairhaven's in the middle. Defying Futility is the story which includes how to save everybody on the Titanic. And it's one of my favorites. That's the questions. And my supplementary slides on the end explain a bit more about what the solutions are, but we've already gone over half an hour, so I better stop now. So I'll stop. Thank you very much.